The rain hammered against the cobblestones of Prague like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of a world at war. It was March 15, 1943, and the city had been swallowed by darkness, not just the darkness of night, but the suffocating darkness of occupation. Nazi banners hung from every building like wounds in the sky, and the sound of jackboots echoed through streets that had once known laughter. But in the shadows of the old Jewish quarter, where centuries of prayers had soaked into the very stones, a different kind of resistance was brewing. And at its heart was a young man whose courage burned brighter than any flame the darkness could extinguish. His name was David Rosenberg, and he was 24 years old with eyes that held the weight of ancient wisdom and a heart that refused to surrender to despair. By day, he worked as a typist in a German administrative office, his head bowed, his fingers dancing across keys that spelled out the bureaucracy of oppression. But by night, he transformed into something else entirely, a phantom who moved through the city like smoke, carrying messages that could spark revolution or doom entire families to death. David had lost everything. His parents had been taken in the first wave of deportations, his younger sister Sarah had vanished into the night 6 months ago, and his childhood home had been seized by officers who now slept in beds that still smelled of his mother's lavender perfume. But instead of breaking him, these losses had forged him into something unbreakable. He had become the voice of the voiceless, the hope of the hopeless, the messenger who carried light into the deepest darkness. Tonight, as rain turned the streets into rivers of despair, David clutched a small leather pouch against his chest. Inside were documents that could change everything, plans for a mass escape, contact information for Allied sympathizers, and most importantly, a list of Nazi collaborators who had been selling out their own neighbors for a handful of coins and the promise of safety that would never come. He moved through the narrow alleyways with the fluid grace of someone who had memorized every shadow, every doorway, every loose stone that might betray his presence. The Gestapo had been hunting him for months, but David seemed to exist in the spaces between their searches, always one step ahead, always vanishing just as their fingers closed around empty air. As he approached the old synagogue where tonight's meeting would take place, David's heart hammered against his ribs. He had learned to trust his instincts, and tonight they were screaming that something was wrong. The street was too quiet, the shadows too deep, the very air thick with the kind of tension that preceded catastrophe. But he had no choice. The information in his pouch was too vital, the lives it could save too precious. He had to deliver it, even if it meant walking into the jaws of death itself. David slipped through a gap in the synagogue's broken wall, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The interior was a graveyard of faith. Torah scrolls lay scattered like broken wings, the ark had been defiled with Nazi graffiti, and the eternal flame had been extinguished months ago. But in the basement, hidden beneath a false floor, the resistance still met. Still planned. Still hoped. As he descended the narrow stairs, David could hear the low murmur of familiar voices. Jacob, the old watchmaker whose steady hands had saved more lives than any surgeon. Maria, the Catholic nurse who risked everything to smuggle medical supplies to the ghetto. And Chen, the Chinese diplomat who used his immunity to ferry messages to the outside world. But as David reached the bottom of the stairs, his blood turned to ice. There, sitting calmly in the circle of conspirators, was a face he recognized. Klaus Richter, a mid-level Nazi official who had been feeding information to the resistance for months. David had never trusted him, but the others had vouched for his sincerity, his apparent guilt over the horrors he had witnessed. Tonight, however, something in Klaus's eyes was different. They held a coldness that made David's skin crawl, a satisfaction that spoke of traps sprung and prey caught. "David," Klaus said, his voice carrying a mock warmth that fooled no one. "We've been waiting for you. I believe you have something for us." The room fell silent. David's hand instinctively moved to the pouch at his chest, but he didn't remove it. Every instinct he possessed was screaming danger, but he was trapped. Behind him, he could hear the soft scrape of boots on stone. The exits had been sealed. "You're wondering how I knew you'd be here tonight," Klaus continued, rising from his chair with the languid grace of a predator. "The answer is simple. I've been watching you for weeks, David, learning your patterns, your routes, your weaknesses." David's mind raced. If Klaus was a double agent, then everything was compromised. The safe houses, the escape routes, the identities of every resistance member in the city. But worse than that, if Klaus had been planning this for weeks, then someone David trusted had been feeding him information. "You're all under arrest," Klaus announced, and suddenly the basement was flooded with Nazi soldiers, their weapons trained on the small group of resistance fighters. "By order of the Reich, you will be taken to their Scienstadt for processing." Their Scienstadt. David's blood turned to ice. It wasn't a concentration camp, it was a death sentence wrapped in bureaucratic language. None of them would survive the night. But as the soldiers moved to secure their prisoners, David made a decision that would echo through history. In one fluid motion, he pulled out a small glass vial from his pocket. Cyanide, the final escape that every resistance fighter carried. But instead of raising it to his own lips, he hurled it directly at Klaus Richter. The vial shattered against the Nazi's forehead, the poison mixing with blood as Klaus screamed and fell to the ground. In the chaos that followed, David lunged not for the stairs, but for the small window high up on the basement wall. It was barely large enough for a child, but desperation gave him strength, and he squeezed through just as bullets began to fly. He hit the alley outside with a bone-jarring impact, rolled to absorb the blow, and began to run. Behind him, he could hear Klaus's voice, distorted by pain but still commanding, "Find him! He has the documents! He cannot escape!" David ran through the night-black streets of Prague, his lungs burning, his heart pounding, the leather pouch clutched against his chest like a talisman. He had failed his friends, failed the resistance, failed everyone who had trusted him. But he still had the documents, and as long as he drew breath, there was still hope. He needed to get to the dead drop, a hollow in the wall of the old Charles Bridge where messages could be left for other resistance cells. If he could get the information to them, maybe some good could still come from this disaster. But as he neared the bridge, David realized he was being herded. The Gestapo had anticipated his route, and soldiers were closing in from all directions. He was trapped, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. That's when he saw her. She appeared like a vision from another world, standing in the middle of the Charles Bridge as if she had materialized from the mist itself. Even in the darkness, David could see that she was beautiful, not in the way that made men stupid, but in the way that made them believe in something greater than themselves. Her hair was dark as midnight, her eyes reflected the scattered light of the stars, and she wore a simple coat that somehow managed to look elegant despite the wartime rationing. But it wasn't her beauty that stopped David in his tracks. It was the way she stood, perfectly still, perfectly calm, as if she alone in all of Prague was unafraid. And when she looked at him, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of being truly seen. "This way," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "Quickly." David had learned to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was telling him to follow this mysterious woman. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward her, and she led him not across the bridge, but down a narrow stone stairway that descended to the water's edge. There, hidden beneath the ancient bridge, was a small boat. She gestured for him to get in, and as soon as he was seated, she pushed off from the stone ledge and began to row with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "Who are you?" David gasped, still catching his breath from his desperate flight. "Someone who believes that love is stronger than hate," she replied, her voice steady despite the exertion of rowing. "And that hope is stronger than despair." As they glided silently down the Vltava River, David studied her face in the moonlight. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, but her eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond her years. There was something familiar about her, but he couldn't quite place it. "The documents," she said, not looking at him. "They're plans for something important, aren't they?" David's hand instinctively moved to the pouch at his chest. "How do you know about the documents?" "Because I've been watching you too, David Rosenberg. But unlike Klaus Richter, I've been watching you because I believe in what you're doing." The sound of his name on her lips sent a shiver down David's spine. "You know who I am? I know that you're the one they call the Ghost. I know that you've saved more lives than any 10 men combined. I know that you've lost everything, but you keep fighting anyway." She paused in her rowing, finally meeting his gaze. "And I know that you're going to help me change the course of history." David felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. "Who are you?" "My name is Elena Kuris," she said, resuming her rowing. "And I'm going to help you save more lives than you ever dreamed possible." Elena. The name suited her perfectly. It meant bright light in Greek, and David could see why. Even in the darkness of occupied Prague, she seemed to glow with an inner radiance that made everything around her seem less hopeless. "Where are we going?" David asked. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere we can plan our next move." Elena's voice carried a quiet confidence that made David want to believe her. "But first, you need to tell me about the documents. What exactly are we trying to save?" David hesitated. He had survived this long by trusting no one completely, by keeping his secrets close to his chest. But something about Elena made him want to tell her everything, not just about the documents, but about the loneliness that ate at him like acid, about the dreams that haunted his sleep, about the way he sometimes stood on rooftops and wondered if it would be easier to simply let go. "They're escape plans," he said finally. "Routes out of the city, contacts in the countryside, safe houses along the way to Switzerland. But more than that, they're lists of people. Families with children, elderly couples, wounded soldiers. People who won't survive another winter under Nazi rule." Elena nodded, her expression grave. "How many people?" 3,000, David said, the number falling from his lips like a prayer. "Maybe more." Elena stopped rowing altogether, her hands frozen on the oars. 3,000 souls, she whispered. "David, do you understand what this means? If we can get these people to safety, if we can save even half of them, we'll have changed the course of history itself." David felt something stirring in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but the possibility of hope. "You really think we can do it?" "I don't think we can do it," Elena said, her eyes blazing with determination. "I know we can do it, but it will require everything we have to give. It will require us to risk not just our lives, but our hearts. As they continued down the river, David found himself studying Elena's profile in the moonlight. There was something about her that reminded him of his sister Sarah, the same quiet strength, the same refusal to be broken by the horror around them. But there was something else too, something that made his pulse quicken and his breath catch in his throat. "Elena," he said softly, "why are you doing this? Why are you helping me?" She was quiet for a long moment, her oars cutting through the dark water with rhythmic precision. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I believe that love is the only force in the universe strong enough to overcome hate. And because I believe that sometimes, if we're very lucky, we meet someone who makes us want to fight for something more than just survival." David felt his heart stop. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying that from the moment I saw you, I knew that my life was about to change forever. I'm saying that I've been waiting for you without even knowing it." Elena's voice grew stronger. "I'm saying that I love you, David Rosenberg, and I'm going to help you save the world." The words hit David like a physical blow. Love. In the middle of a war, in the darkness of occupation, in the shadow of death itself, this extraordinary woman was speaking of love. It should have been impossible, should have been the cruelest joke imaginable. But looking into Elena's eyes, David felt something he had thought was lost forever, the ability to believe in tomorrow. "I love you too," he whispered, the words torn from his soul like a confession. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you on the bridge. I don't know how, I don't know why, but I love you with everything I am." Elena smiled then, and it was like watching the sun rise after the longest night in history. "Then we're going to do impossible things together, David. We're going to save 3,000 lives, and we're going to do it with love as our weapon." As they reached the shore, David realized that his life had just been divided into two parts, before Elena and after Elena. Everything that had happened to him before this moment, the loss, the pain, the desperate struggle for survival, had been preparing him for this. For her. For love. But he also realized that the easy part was over. Now came the hard part, turning love into action, hope into reality, and dreams into the kind of miracle that could change the course of history. Elena led David through a maze of narrow streets and hidden passages that seemed to exist in the spaces between the official maps of Prague. They moved like shadows, pausing at corners to listen for the sound of patrols, slipping through doorways that opened at Elena's touch as if she possessed some kind of magic key to the city's secrets. Finally, they arrived at what appeared to be an abandoned bookshop in the old quarter. The windows were boarded up, the door hung askew on its hinges, and years of neglect had given the building the appearance of a dead thing. But when Elena pressed her hand against a seemingly random brick in the wall, a section of the facade swung inward to reveal a hidden entrance. "Welcome to the sanctuary," Elena said, gesturing for David to follow her inside. What David saw took his breath away. The interior of the building had been transformed into something that belonged in a fairy tale. The walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling, not just any books, but volumes that had been rescued from Nazi bonfires, private collections that had been hidden away before their owners were taken, manuscripts that contained the accumulated wisdom of centuries. But it wasn't just a library. In the center of the space was a workshop where skilled craftsmen were creating false documents with meticulous care. In another corner, a woman was operating a radio that crackled with messages from the outside world. And everywhere, people were working with the quiet efficiency of those who knew that lives hung in the balance. "This is incredible," David breathed. "How long has this been here?" "Since the occupation began," Elena replied. "But it's older than that, really. This building has been a sanctuary for 300 years. During the Counter-Reformation, it sheltered Protestant families. During the pogroms, it protected Jewish scholars. During the last war, it hid Austrian resistance fighters." She smiled sadly. "Every generation finds its own use for sanctuary." David was introduced to the others, a small group of people who, like Elena, seemed to exist in the spaces between the official world and the hidden one. There was Marcus, a former university professor who now specialized in creating identities for people who needed to disappear. There was Sister Catherine, a nun who had abandoned her convent to become a forger of extraordinary skill. And there was Anton, a Czech partisan who had been fighting the Nazis since the first day of occupation. But it was Elena who clearly led this group, and as David watched her move among them, he began to understand that she was far more than just a beautiful woman who had rescued him from the streets. She was a leader, a strategist, a person who could see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. "Show them the documents," Elena said to David, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. David hesitated for only a moment before removing the leather pouch from his chest. As he spread the papers across a large table, he watched the faces of the others change. Marcus began to smile. Sister Catherine crossed herself. Anton let out a low whistle of appreciation. 3,000 people, Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder. "David, this is the most complete escape plan I've ever seen. The routes are brilliant, the safe houses are perfectly positioned, and the timing." He shook his head. "It's like someone had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain." Because someone did, Elena said quietly. David, these documents weren't created by your resistance cell. They were created by someone with access to the highest levels of Nazi command structure. David felt the room spin around him. That's impossible. Klaus Richter was feeding us false information. He was working for the Nazis all along. Klaus Richter was working for the Nazis, Elena agreed. But he wasn't the only one with access to this information. Someone else has been playing a much longer game. She moved to a wall covered with maps and photographs, pointing to a series of red pins that marked locations throughout the city. For the past 6 months, we've been tracking patterns in Nazi behavior. Troop movements, administrative decisions, changes in policy. And we've identified someone who has been systematically undermining the occupation from within. David stared at the maps, his mind reeling. You're saying there's a Nazi working for the resistance? I'm saying there's someone in the Nazi hierarchy who has been working to minimize civilian casualties, to create opportunities for escape, to leave doors open that should have been closed. Elena's voice carried a mixture of admiration and sadness. Someone who has been risking everything to save lives. But who? David asked. Elena reached into her coat and pulled out a photograph. It showed a Nazi officer, tall, blonde, with the kind of sharp features that belonged on propaganda posters. But his eyes were different from what David expected. They held a depth of pain that spoke of someone who had seen too much, done too much, and was desperately trying to find a way to make amends. His name is Captain Friedrich Weber, Elena said softly. And he's been in love with me for 2 years. The words hit David like a physical blow. Jealousy, hot and irrational, flooded through him before he could stop it. You're working with a Nazi? I'm working with a man who has been trying to save lives, Elena replied, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting the pain of old wounds. A man who has been using his position to protect people like you. David felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Elena, you can't trust him. You can't trust any of them. I don't trust him, Elena said quietly. But I love him. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. David felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces, each fragment cutting deeper than the last. You love him. I love you both, Elena whispered, and David saw tears beginning to form in her eyes. And that's going to be the death of all of us. The room fell silent. David could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the documents in his hands, could sense the eyes of the others watching him. But all he could focus on was the pain in Elena's voice, the impossible confession that had just torn his world apart. Elena, he said finally, his voice breaking. How is that possible? Because love isn't rational, David. Because the heart doesn't recognize borders or uniforms or ideologies. Elena's voice grew stronger. Because 2 years ago, I was a different person living a different life, and I fell in love with a man who I thought was different from what he appeared to be. And because 3 hours ago, I met you, and I fell in love again, deeper and more completely than I ever thought possible. David wanted to be angry. He wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all, to demand that Elena choose between him and the Nazi captain. But looking at her face, seeing the genuine anguish in her eyes, he found that he couldn't. Instead, he found himself asking the only question that mattered. What do we do now? Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and David saw her transform from a woman in pain back into the leader he had first glimpsed. Now we save 3,000 lives. We use Friedrich's position, my connections, and your courage to pull off the greatest rescue in the history of this war. And after that? David asked. After that, we face the consequences of loving the wrong people at the wrong time in the wrong war. Elena's voice carried a sadness that seemed to echo from the depths of her soul. But David, I need you to understand something. What I feel for Friedrich, it's real, but it's the love of who I was. What I feel for you, it's the love of who I'm becoming. And if we're going to save these people, if we're going to change the course of history, I need you to believe that what we have is worth fighting for. David looked at the documents in his hands, at the faces of the people around him, at the woman who had become his entire world in the space of a few hours. He thought about the 3,000 people whose lives hung in the balance, about the choice between love and jealousy, between hope and despair. I believe, he said simply. I believe in you, in us, in the possibility that love really can conquer hate. But Elena, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when this is over, when we've saved everyone we can save, you'll choose. Not between Friedrich and me, but between the person you were and the person you're becoming. Promise me that you'll choose your own future. Elena reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I promise, David. I promise that I'll choose love over fear, hope over despair, and the future over the past. As their hands touched, David felt something electric pass between them, not just attraction, but a recognition that went deeper than the physical, deeper than the emotional. It was as if two halves of the same soul had finally found each other across the darkness of war and the complexity of human hearts. But even as they touched, David knew that the hardest part was still ahead. They would have to work with Friedrich Weber, the Nazi captain who loved the same woman David loved. They would have to trust their lives to a man who wore the uniform of their oppressors. And they would have to do it all while keeping their true feelings hidden from someone who could destroy them all with a single word. The sanctuary had become a crucible, and David realized that what emerged from it would either be the greatest love story ever told, or the most tragic. David found himself in the last place he had ever expected to be, sitting across from a Nazi officer in a candlelit restaurant that seemed to exist in a different world from the one outside its walls. Captain Friedrich Weber was exactly as he had appeared in the photograph, but in person, he carried himself with a kind of quiet authority that came from years of command and the weight of terrible decisions. Elena sat between them, her presence the only thing that kept David from reaching across the table and attempting to strangle the man who represented everything he had been fighting against. But as the evening progressed, David found himself facing a disturbing reality. Friedrich Weber was not the monster he had expected. The captain spoke softly, his English heavily accented but precise. "I want you to understand, Mr. Rosenberg, that I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to use me." David studied the man's face, looking for signs of deception, for the cold calculation he associated with Nazi officers. Instead, he found something far more troubling, genuine remorse and a desperate desire for redemption. "Why?" David asked bluntly. "Why are you doing this?" Friedrich was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. "Because I have seen what we are capable of. Because I have given orders that I cannot take back. Because I have watched children die and done nothing to stop it." He looked up, meeting David's eyes. "Because I am trying to save my soul, and I believe that helping you save these people may be the only way to do it." Elena reached across the table and placed her hand over Friedrich's. The gesture sent a spike of jealousy through David's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Tell him about the trains," she said softly. Friedrich's face darkened. "Next week, there will be a transport. 3 trains, carrying approximately 1,000 people each, bound for Treblinka." He paused, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. "I have been ordered to oversee the operation." David felt his blood turn to ice. Treblinka wasn't a labor camp or a prison. It was a death factory, a place where human beings were reduced to numbers and then to ash. 3,000 people, he whispered. "The same 3,000 people listed in your documents," Friedrich confirmed. "The operation has been planned for months. They are being taken not because they are dangerous, but because they are inconvenient. Because someone has decided that Prague would be cleaner without them." "And you're going to help us stop it?" David asked. "I'm going to help you save them," Friedrich replied. "But David, you must understand the cost. If we are discovered, if anyone suspects what we are doing, the consequences will be immediate and final. Not just for us, but for everyone we care about." Elena leaned forward, her voice intense. "Tell him about the route." Friedrich reached into his jacket and pulled out a map, spreading it across the table. "The trains will travel this route, through the countryside toward the Polish border. But here," he pointed to a section of track that ran through a dense forest, "there is a place where the rail line crosses a bridge over a gorge. If the bridge were to be damaged, the trains would be forced to stop." David studied the map, his mind racing. How long would they be stopped? "Long enough," Friedrich said. "The repair crews would need at least 12 hours to make the track passable again. During that time, the prisoners would be held in a temporary camp approximately 2 kilometers from the bridge." "A camp that could be liberated," Elena added. David felt his heart beginning to race. It was audacious beyond belief, but it was also possible. "What about guards?" "Minimal," Friedrich replied. "The assumption is that 3,000 civilians, many of them elderly or sick, pose no threat in the middle of the forest. There will be perhaps 30 guards, armed but not expecting trouble." "And afterward?" David asked. "What happens to the people we rescue?" Elena smiled for the first time that evening. "That's where the real plan begins. We've been working with partisan groups throughout the region. Safe houses, supply depots, guides who know the mountain passes into Switzerland. We can get them out, David. We can save them all." David stared at the map, seeing not just lines and symbols but the faces of 3,000 people who would live or die based on the decisions made in this room. "When?" he asked. "1 week from today," Friedrich said. "The operation begins at dawn." David felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. "And if we succeed?" "If we succeed," Elena said, her voice filled with quiet intensity, "we will have struck a blow against evil that will resonate through history. We will have proved that love really can conquer hate, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept the unacceptable." Friedrich reached across the table and extended his hand toward David. "I know what I am asking of you. I know that I am asking you to work with someone you have every reason to hate, but I am also asking you to help me become the man I should have been from the beginning." David stared at the outstretched hand, knowing that taking it would change everything. He would be allying himself with a Nazi officer, trusting his life and the lives of 3,000 others to a man who wore the uniform of oppression. But he would also be taking a step towards something larger than himself, something that could justify all the pain and loss he had endured. Slowly, David reached across the table and grasped Friedrich's hand. "If you betray us," he said quietly, "I will kill you myself." Friedrich nodded solemnly. "If I betray you, you will be doing me a favor." As their hands clasped, David felt the strange sensation of his world shifting on its axis once again. He was forming an alliance with his enemy, trusting his heart to a woman who loved two men, and preparing to attempt something that would either save 3,000 lives or doom them all. But as he looked at Elena's face, saw the hope shining in her eyes, David realized that some risks were worth taking. Some loves were worth fighting for, and some moments in history were worth dying for. "1 week," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging in his chest. "1 week," Friedrich agreed. "1 week," Elena echoed, and David could hear in her voice the same mixture of terror and exhilaration that he felt in his own heart. They spent the rest of the evening planning, going over every detail of the operation with the kind of methodical precision that could mean the difference between salvation and catastrophe. But underneath the tactical discussions, David was aware of another conversation taking place, the silent communication between three people who had found themselves bound together by circumstances beyond their control. As the night wore on, David found himself studying Friedrich's face, looking for signs of the monster he wanted to see. Instead, he found a man who was clearly haunted by his past, desperate for redemption, and genuinely in love with the same woman who had become David's entire world. And that, David realized, was the most dangerous thing of all. It would have been easy to hate Friedrich if he had been a caricature of evil. But this man, this complex, tortured, genuinely decent human being who had made terrible choices and was now trying to make amends, this man was someone David could understand. Perhaps even someone he could forgive. But forgiveness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Not yet. Not until 3,000 lives had been saved and the future had been secured. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Elena turned to both men. "I need you both to understand something," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "What we're about to do will change us forever. We will not be the same people when this is over. And whatever happens between us, whatever we decide about the future, we will have this. We will have the knowledge that we chose love over hate, hope over despair, and action over acceptance." David looked at her, then at Friedrich, then back at her. "Are you saying goodbye?" "I'm saying that I love you both, and I'm prepared to die for both of you, and I'm prepared to live with the consequences of both of those truths." Elena's voice broke slightly. "I'm saying that this is the most important week of our lives, and we're going to face it together." As they stepped out into the night air, David felt the weight of the approaching operation settling on his shoulders like a mantle. In 7 days, he would either be dead or he would be part of the greatest rescue in the history of World War II. In 7 days, he would either lose Elena forever or find a way to build a future with her that transcended the complexities of war and the heart. But tonight, walking through the streets of Prague with the woman he loved and the man who might be his salvation or his doom, David allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. The sanctuary of secrets had become a crucible of hope. And in 1 week, they would discover whether hope was strong enough to change the course of history. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. David threw himself into the planning with the intensity of a man who knew that perfection was the only thing standing between 3,000 people and death. He studied maps until his eyes burned, memorized guard rotations until he could recite them in his sleep, and rehearsed every aspect of the operation until his muscles moved without conscious thought. But beneath the surface of tactical preparation, something else was happening. David found himself drawn into an unlikely friendship with Friedrich Weber, the Nazi captain who was risking everything to save lives. It began with professional respect. Friedrich's strategic mind was exceptional, his knowledge of German military procedures invaluable, and his commitment to the mission absolute. But as they worked together late into the night, planning routes and timing and contingencies, David began to see the man beneath the uniform. Friedrich spoke of his childhood in Bavaria, of a father who had died in the First World War, of a mother who had raised him to believe in honor and duty. He spoke of the slow corruption of ideals, of how small compromises had led to larger ones, of how he had found himself complicit in horrors he never could have imagined. "The hardest part," Friedrich said during one of their late-night planning sessions, "is not the guilt. It's the knowledge that guilt is a luxury I haven't earned. I have no right to feel sorry for myself when I have been part of something so monstrous." David found himself responding with an honesty that surprised him. "The hardest part for me is not the loss. It's the fear that I'm becoming someone I don't recognize. That the war is turning me into something harder, colder, more willing to accept that some people are beyond redemption." Friedrich looked up from the map they were studying. "And what do you think now?" David met his eyes. "I think that redemption isn't something you earn. It's something you choose, moment by moment, decision by decision. And I think that maybe the fact that you're here, doing this, means you've already chosen." It was Elena who noticed the change first. "You're becoming friends," she said one evening as the three of them sat in the sanctuary, finalizing their plans. "It wasn't a question. We're becoming something," David admitted. "I'm not sure what to call it." "It's what happens when people discover they're fighting for the same thing," Friedrich said quietly. "Even if they're fighting from opposite sides." Elena smiled sadly. "And what are you fighting for?" "The same thing you are," David replied. "The chance to prove that love is stronger than hate." But even as friendship grew between the two men, the tension between them remained. They were united in their mission, but they were still rivals for the same woman's heart. And Elena, caught between them, was struggling with feelings that defied easy categorization. One evening, 3 days before the operation, David found her standing alone on the roof of the sanctuary, looking out over the city. The lights of Prague twinkled below them like fallen stars, and for a moment, it was possible to forget that they were living in the middle of a war. "You're thinking about the future," David said, joining her at the edge of the roof. "I'm thinking about the present," Elena replied. "About how impossible it is to hold two loves in one heart without feeling like you're betraying both of them." David felt his chest tighten. "Elena, you know that after this is over, you're going to have to choose." "I know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "And I know that whatever I choose, someone is going to be destroyed." "Maybe," David said. "Or maybe we'll find a way to make it work. Maybe love doesn't have to be about possession. Maybe it can be about something larger." Elena turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "David, do you understand what you're saying?" "I'm saying that I love you more than I've ever loved anyone. I'm saying that I want to spend my life with you, build a future with you, grow old with you." David's voice grew stronger. "But I'm also saying that I would rather share you with someone I respect than lose you to someone I despise." "And Friedrich, you respect him?" David was quiet for a long moment. "I respect what he's trying to become. I respect the choice he's made to risk everything for strangers. I respect the fact that he loves you enough to help me save you, even though it might mean losing you." Elena reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "And if we survive this, if we actually manage to save 3,000 people and live to tell about it, then we'll figure it out," David said. "The three of us, together. We'll find a way to make love work in a world that seems designed to destroy it." They stood in silence for a while, holding each other as the city slept below them. But David knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve. And in just 3 days, they would either achieve something miraculous or die trying. The weight of love, he realized, was heavier than the weight of war. Because war was simple, you had enemies and you fought them. But love was complex, nuanced, full of impossible choices and competing loyalties. Love required you to be brave enough to fight for what you wanted and wise enough to know when to let go. As they prepared to return to the sanctuary, Elena stopped him with a hand on his arm. "David, I need you to know something. Whatever happens, whatever I decide, you have changed me forever. You have made me believe in possibilities I never knew existed. And you have made me believe in tomorrow," David replied. "In a world where love can conquer hate, where ordinary people can do extraordinary things, where the future is worth fighting for." They kissed then, under the stars above Prague, with the weight of 3,000 lives pressing down on them and the promise of an uncertain future stretching ahead. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and desperation, of love and loss, of all the things that made life worth living even in the darkest of times. But even as they kissed, David was aware of a figure watching them from the shadows. Friedrich Weber, the Nazi captain who had sacrificed everything for love, standing alone with his own impossible choices and his own broken heart. Tomorrow, they would begin the final preparations for the greatest rescue in the history of World War II. But tonight, they were just 3 people caught in the crossfire of love and war, trying to find a way to save the world without destroying themselves in the process. The morning of the operation dawned gray and cold, with a mist that seemed to rise from the very stones of Prague. David woke before sunrise, his body tense with anticipation and fear. Today, everything they had planned, everything they had risked, would be put to the test. He found Elena already awake, sitting by the window of the sanctuary, watching the sun struggle through the clouds. She looked ethereal in the early morning light, but David could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup. "Are you ready?" he asked, sitting beside her. "No," she said honestly. "Are you?" "No," David admitted. "But I think that's the point. If we were ready for something like this, it would mean we'd done it before. And if we'd done it before, it would mean we'd failed to save people sooner." Elena smiled at that, the first genuine smile David had seen from her in days. "You have a gift for finding hope in the darkest places." "I learned it from you," David replied. Friedrich arrived an hour later, dressed in his Nazi uniform but carrying himself with the bearing of a man who had made peace with his choices. He looked tired, older than his years, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes that David recognized as the look of someone who had found his purpose. "The trains are on schedule," Friedrich reported. They will reach the bridge at approximately 1400 hours. The explosives team is already in position. David nodded. They had spent weeks planning this moment, coordinating with partisan groups throughout the region, establishing supply lines and escape routes. The plan was complex, requiring precise timing and flawless execution, but it was also their only chance. The guards? Elena asked. 32 men, as expected. They will be tired from the journey and not expecting trouble. But they are still armed, still dangerous. Friedrich's voice carried the weight of professional assessment. We will have perhaps 20 minutes between the time the trains stop and the time reinforcements arrive. 20 minutes to evacuate 3,000 people, David mused. It sounds impossible. It is impossible, Friedrich agreed. Unless we have help. As if summoned by his words, the sanctuary began to fill with people. David recognized some of them. Members of the resistance, partisan fighters, ordinary citizens who had chosen to risk everything for strangers. But there were others too, people he had never seen before, who had somehow learned about the operation and decided to join. Marcus, the former professor, approached them with a clipboard in hand. We have 137 volunteers, he reported. Doctors, nurses, drivers, guides, people who want to help. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. These were ordinary people, shopkeepers, teachers, factory workers, who had chosen to risk their lives for others. They had no obligation to be here, no personal stake in the operation beyond their shared humanity. They understand the risks? Elena asked. They understand that they might die, Marcus replied. And they're here anyway. Sister Catherine stepped forward, her nun's habit replaced by practical clothing, but her eyes still carrying the serenity of deep faith. Mr. Rosenberg, I want you to know that we're not here because we're brave. We're here because we can't live with ourselves if we don't try. David looked around the room at the faces of the volunteers, young and old, men and women, Czech and German and Jewish and Christian. They were united not by nationality or religion or politics, but by something deeper, the refusal to accept that evil was stronger than good. Then let's go save some lives, David said. The journey to the bridge took 3 hours, moving in small groups through the forest to avoid detection. David found himself walking beside Friedrich, the two men moving through the trees with the practiced silence of soldiers. Are you frightened? Friedrich asked quietly. Terrified, David admitted. You. Beyond measure, Friedrich replied. But also, relieved. For the first time in years, I know exactly who I am and what I'm supposed to be doing. And what's that? A man who is willing to die for love, Friedrich said simply. They reached the staging area just as the distant sound of train whistles echoed through the forest. David felt his heart begin to race. This was it, the moment when all their planning would either save 3,000 lives or doom them all. Elena appeared at his side, her face painted with camouflage but her eyes bright with determination. The explosives team is ready. The medical station is set up. The escape routes are clear. And the guards. Positioned exactly where we expected them to be, Friedrich reported. They're tired, bored, and completely unprepared for what's about to happen. David looked around at the volunteers, scattered through the forest like guardian angels, waiting for the signal to begin the greatest rescue in the history of World War II. He thought about his parents, about his sister Sarah, about all the people who had died while he was still learning how to fight. Today, he would honor their memory by saving others. Elena, he said, taking her hand. Whatever happens, I want you to know that these have been the best days of my life. Mine too, she replied, squeezing his fingers. Friedrich stepped forward, extending his hand once more. David, it has been an honor to fight beside you. The honor has been mine, David replied, grasping the other man's hand. And Friedrich, take care of her. We'll take care of each other, Friedrich said. All of us. The sound of the trains grew louder, and David could feel the vibration through the soles of his feet. In the distance, he could see the smoke from the engines, the dark shapes of the cars filled with people who had no idea that salvation was waiting for them in the forest. 30 seconds, Elena whispered, her hand on the radio that would signal the demolition team. David closed his eyes and thought about love, not just romantic love, but the love that connected all human beings, the love that made it impossible to stand by while others suffered, the love that was strong enough to change the course of history. Now, Elena said, and pressed the button. The explosion was enormous, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Trees swayed, birds erupted from their nests, and in the distance, David could hear the screech of metal on metal as the trains ground to a halt. For a moment, the forest was silent except for the ringing in David's ears. Then, from the direction of the bridge, came the sound of voices, confused, frightened, but alive. Go, David whispered, and 137 volunteers began to move through the forest like a wave of hope, racing toward 3,000 people who were about to discover that love really could conquer hate. The rescue had begun. The scene that greeted David as he emerged from the forest was one of controlled chaos. The 3 trains had indeed stopped, their engines hissing steam into the cold air, their cars filled with people who had no idea what was happening. Nazi guards were running back and forth, trying to establish a perimeter, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by volunteers who seemed to appear from every shadow. David's heart clenched as he saw the faces in the train cars, elderly men and women, young mothers clutching babies, children with eyes too old for their years. These were the people the documents had listed as numbers, but seeing them in person, David was struck by the overwhelming weight of individual humanity. Medical team to car 3. Elena's voice crackled through the radio. We have injured people here. David sprinted toward the sound of her voice, weaving between volunteers who were helping people down from the train cars. The operation was proceeding with remarkable efficiency. The months of planning were paying off as each team executed their assigned tasks with precision. But it was the faces of the rescued that took David's breath away. There was an elderly man who fell to his knees and kissed the ground when he realized he was free. There was a young mother who wept as she held her baby, whispering prayers in 3 different languages. There was a teenage boy who looked around in wonder, as if he couldn't believe that strangers would risk their lives for him. David! Friedrich's voice cut through the chaos. We have a problem. David turned to see the Nazi captain pointing toward the eastern edge of the forest. In the distance, a cloud of dust was rising, vehicles approaching fast. The reinforcements were arriving ahead of schedule. How long? David called back. 10 minutes, maybe less. David felt a surge of panic. They had evacuated perhaps half of the 3,000 people, but the rest were still trapped in the train cars, still waiting for rescue. 10 minutes wasn't enough time. Elena, he shouted, we need to speed this up. I'm trying, she replied, her voice strained. But some of these people are too weak to move quickly. They need medical attention. David made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Running to the center of the evacuation area, he climbed onto a fallen log and raised his voice to carry over the chaos. Listen to me, he shouted. All of you. We don't have much time left. The strong need to help the weak. The young need to carry the old. We are all in this together. The effect was immediate. People who had been moving slowly began to move faster. Men lifted elderly women onto their backs. Teenagers formed human chains to help children down from the train cars. The evacuation, which had been proceeding in an orderly fashion, suddenly became a desperate race against time. But it was working. David could see the numbers changing, could feel the momentum building. The volunteers were performing miracles, and the rescued were helping to rescue others. Love was becoming action, hope was becoming reality. 5 minutes, Friedrich called out, his voice tight with tension. David ran to the last train car, where Sister Catherine was helping a group of sick and elderly people to safety. Among them was an old woman who looked familiar, and as David got closer, his heart nearly stopped. Sarah, he whispered. The old woman looked up, and David saw his sister's eyes looking back at him. But this wasn't the vibrant 20-year-old who had disappeared 6 months ago. This was a broken woman, aged beyond her years, her body ravaged by hunger and disease. David, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Oh, Sarah, David breathed, gathering her into his arms. I thought you were dead. I was dead, she replied, her voice gaining strength. But now I'm alive again. David felt tears streaming down his face as he lifted his sister and began to carry her toward the forest. Around them, the evacuation was reaching its climax. Nearly all 3,000 people were free, moving through the trees toward safety and hope. 2 minutes. Friedrich's voice carried a note of urgency that made David's blood run cold. Elena! David called out. We need to go. Almost finished, she replied. Just a few more people. David could hear the sound of engines now, getting closer. He looked back and saw Friedrich standing alone near the trains, his Nazi uniform making him a target for his own forces. The man was sacrificing himself to buy them precious seconds. Friedrich! David shouted. Come on! But Friedrich shook his head. Someone needs to delay them. Get Elena to safety. David felt a moment of terrible clarity. Friedrich was going to die, and he was going to die alone, branded as a traitor by his own people. But he was also going to die as a hero, having saved 3,000 lives. Elena! David called out desperately. We have to go now. Elena appeared at his side, her face streaked with tears and dirt but her eyes blazing with triumph. We did it, David. We saved them all. Not all, David said, looking back at Friedrich. Not all of us. Elena followed his gaze and saw Friedrich standing alone by the trains, waiting for the reinforcements to arrive. She started to run toward him, but David caught her arm. He made his choice, David said gently. He chose to save us. Don't let his sacrifice be meaningless. Elena looked back one more time, and David saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer or a goodbye. Then she turned and ran with him into the forest, towards safety and an uncertain future. Behind them, the sound of gunfire erupted as the Nazi reinforcements arrived. David didn't look back, but he knew that Friedrich Weber, the Nazi captain who had found redemption in love, was making his final stand. As they reached the safety of the deep forest, David found himself surrounded by 3,000 people who owed their lives to the courage of volunteers, the power of love, and the sacrifice of a man who had worn the uniform of evil but chosen to serve the cause of good. "Is it over?" Sarah asked weakly, still in David's arms. "The rescue is over," David replied, looking at Elena, who was organizing the medical teams even as tears streamed down her face. "But the real work is just beginning." In the distance, the sound of gunfire faded. Friedrich Weber was dead, but his legacy lived on in the lives he had saved and the love he had protected. The greatest rescue in the history of World War II was complete, but the greatest love story was just beginning its next chapter. The evacuation through the mountains took 3 weeks, and every day was a testament to the power of human resilience. 3,000 people, many of them weak from months of deprivation, traveled through treacherous terrain guided by partisans who knew every hidden path, every safe cave, every stream that could provide clean water. David found himself taking care of 2 people. His sister Sarah, who was slowly recovering her strength, and Elena, who had thrown herself into the work of organizing the exodus with such intensity that she barely slept or ate. "You're going to collapse if you don't rest," David told her one evening as they camped in a valley high in the mountains. Around them, 3,000 people were settling in for the night, their campfires creating a constellation of hope in the darkness. "I can't rest," Elena replied, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Friedrich standing by those trains. I see him choosing to die so that we could live." David took her hand, feeling the calluses that had formed from weeks of hard travel. "He made that choice because he loved you, because he wanted you to have a future." "And what kind of future is it?" Elena asked, her voice breaking. "I'm alive because a good man died. How do I live with that?" David didn't have an answer. He was struggling with the same questions, the same guilt, the same impossible weight of survival. But he had learned something during their journey through the mountains, something that had taken him weeks to understand. "You live with it by making his sacrifice meaningful," David said finally. "By building the kind of world he died to create. By choosing love over hate, hope over despair, every single day for the rest of your life." Elena looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "And how do we do that?" "Together," David said simply. "We do it together." They reached the Swiss border on a morning when the sun broke through the clouds like a promise. David stood at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the valley below where Swiss officials were waiting to process the refugees. After months of darkness, after years of war, after a lifetime of loss, they had finally reached safety. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice stronger now after weeks of recovery. "We actually did it." "Friedrich did it," Elena said quietly. "All of us did it." David watched as 3,000 people began their descent into Switzerland, into freedom, into the possibility of rebuilding their lives. Many of them would never see their homes again, would never recover what they had lost. But they were alive, and that was everything. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. David looked at Elena, who had become his anchor in the storm, his reason for believing in tomorrow. "Now we figure out how to live in a world where love conquered hate. We figure out how to honor the dead by celebrating life." "And us?" Elena asked. "What happens to us?" David had been thinking about this question for weeks, ever since the moment Friedrich had chosen to sacrifice himself. He had been jealous of the Nazi captain, had seen him as a rival for Elena's affections. But in the end, Friedrich had given them something far more precious than competition. He had given them the chance to build a love that was worthy of his sacrifice. "I think," David said carefully, "that we spend the rest of our lives trying to be worthy of the love we've been given. Both the love we feel for each other and the love that Friedrich showed us." Elena smiled for the first time in weeks. "Are you saying you want to spend your life with me?" "I'm saying I want to spend my life with you, building the kind of world that Friedrich died to create. A world where love is stronger than hate, where hope is stronger than despair, where ordinary people can do extraordinary things." "And if we have children?" Elena asked. "Then we'll tell them stories," David replied. "Stories about heroes who wore the uniforms of enemies but chose to serve the cause of love. Stories about ordinary people who risked everything for strangers. Stories about how love really can change the course of history." As they began their own descent into Switzerland, David felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see an elderly man he didn't recognize, one of the 3,000 they had rescued. "Thank you," the man said simply. "Thank you for giving us back our lives." David felt tears in his eyes. Thank Friedrich Weber. Thank all the volunteers. Thank everyone who chose love over hate. "I will," the man promised. "And I will tell my grandchildren about the day that love conquered evil." As they reached the bottom of the valley, David was struck by the sight of 3,000 people walking freely under the open sky. They were tired, they were hungry, they were traumatized by what they had endured. But they were alive. They were free. They were the living proof that love really could change the course of history. David, Elena said, taking his hand as they walked toward the Swiss officials. I need you to know something. I loved Friedrich, and I will always love him. But what I feel for you, it's different. It's the love of tomorrow, not yesterday. It's the love of the person I want to become, not the person I was. I know, David replied. And I love you for exactly who you are, including the part of you that will always love him. They were processed by the Swiss authorities, given papers that declared them refugees, assigned to a camp where they would wait for word about their future. But David knew that the real work was just beginning. They would have to rebuild their lives, find ways to contribute to a world that was still at war, carry the memory of Friedrich Weber's sacrifice into whatever came next. But they would do it together. They would do it with love as their guide and hope as their compass. They would do it as living proof that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, love really can conquer hate. 6 months later, David stood in the offices of the International Red Cross in Geneva, looking out at the lake where swans glided across water that reflected the sky like a mirror. In his hand was a letter that had arrived that morning, postmarked from Prague. More testimonies? Elena asked, joining him at the window. She looked healthier now, her cheeks had color again, and her eyes held the light that had first attracted David to her. 37 this week, David confirmed. People who were on the trains, people who were in the camps, people who heard about what happened and wanted to add their voices to the record. Elena took the letter from his hand and read it aloud. Dear Mr. Rosenberg and Miss Curies, my name is Maria Svoboda. I was on the second train with my 2 children when you saved us. I want you to know that my daughter Anna graduated from university last month. She wants to become a doctor so she can save lives the way you saved ours. I thought you should know that your courage is still changing the world. David felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever he read these letters. There were hundreds of them now, from people whose lives had been saved by the rescue operation. They told stories of children who had grown up to become teachers, of couples who had found love in the refugee camps, of families who had rebuilt their lives in new countries. The ripple effect, Elena said softly. That's what Sister Catherine calls it. One act of love creating circles of hope that spread outward forever. David nodded. They had been working with the Red Cross for months now, documenting the stories of the rescued, helping to reunite families, building a record of what had happened in the forest that day. But more than that, they had been trying to understand the larger meaning of what they had done. There's something else, Elena said, her voice carrying a note of excitement. A telegram from London. They want us to come to England. They want us to help plan similar operations in other occupied territories. David turned from the window. How many people? Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. The British have been studying our operation, and they think it can be replicated. They want us to help train other resistance groups, to teach them what we learned. David felt a surge of hope so strong it almost knocked him over. The rescue in the forest had been successful beyond their wildest dreams, but it had also felt like a single moment of light in an ocean of darkness. The possibility that it could be repeated, that their methods could save thousands more lives, was almost too wonderful to believe. And Sarah? David asked. She wants to come with us. She says she's tired of being a victim. She wants to learn how to be a hero. David smiled. His sister had recovered remarkably in the months since the rescue, not just physically but emotionally. She had found purpose in helping other refugees, in sharing her story, in proving that survival was possible even in the darkest circumstances. What about Friedrich's family? David asked. Have you heard anything? Elena's expression grew sad. His mother received the letter I wrote. She thanked me for telling her the truth about how he died. She said she was proud of the man he became, even if it meant losing him. David had been amazed by Elena's decision to write to Friedrich's family, to tell them about their son's sacrifice. It had been a risk. They could have betrayed her to the authorities, could have refused to believe that their son had died a hero. But instead, they had embraced the truth, had chosen to honor his memory by supporting the very cause he had died for. There's something else, Elena said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small package. This arrived yesterday. It's from Bavaria. David opened the package to find a photograph of a young Friedrich Weber in civilian clothes, smiling at the camera with the innocent joy of someone who had not yet been touched by war. On the back, in careful handwriting, was a message, for the woman who helped our son find his way home. They want us to have it, Elena said. They want us to remember him not as a Nazi officer, but as the man who chose love over hate. David stared at the photograph, seeing in Friedrich's young face the echo of the man who had sacrificed everything for the woman he loved and the cause he had come to believe in. It was a reminder that evil was not a uniform or a nationality, but a choice. And that heroism was not about never making mistakes, but about finding the courage to make things right. We'll go to London, David said finally. We'll help them plan more operations. We'll save more lives. And after the war? Elena asked. What happens when there are no more people to rescue, no more operations to plan? David took her hand, looking into the eyes that had become his home. After the war, we'll get married. We'll have children. We'll tell them stories about their Uncle Friedrich, who taught us that love is stronger than hate. And we'll raise them to believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Elena smiled, the smile that had first made David believe in tomorrow. And if they ask us about the war? If they ask us what we did? We'll tell them the truth, David replied. We'll tell them that we were three people who fell in love at the worst possible time in the worst possible place. We'll tell them that love made us brave enough to save 3,000 lives. And we'll tell them that the most important thing we learned was that love doesn't conquer hate by destroying it, but by transforming it into something better. They stood together at the window, looking out at the lake where swans moved in perfect harmony, where the water reflected not just the sky but the possibility of a world where love really could change the course of history. In 6 months, they would be in London, training other resistance groups, planning operations that would save thousands more lives. In 2 years, the war would be over, and they would return to a Europe that was rebuilding itself on the foundations of hope. In 5 years, they would be married, living in a small house in Switzerland where refugees from around the world would come to share their stories and find healing. But today, they were just two people who had learned that love was not just an emotion, but a choice. A choice to see the humanity in your enemies, to find the courage to risk everything for strangers, to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. The ripple effect of their love would continue to spread outward, touching lives they would never know, inspiring actions they would never witness, creating a chain of hope that would stretch across generations. And in the end, that was the greatest love story of all, not just the story of two people who found each other, but the story of how their love became a force that changed the world. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Love. London, 1944. The war room in the British intelligence headquarters was filled with maps, photographs, and the quiet intensity of people who knew that lives hung in the balance. David stood at the center of it all, pointing to locations on a map of occupied France where similar rescue operations could be conducted. The key is timing, he explained to the assembled group of resistance leaders and allied operatives. You have to coordinate the sabotage with the evacuation. Too early, and they'll change their plans. Too late, and you'll miss your window. Elena stood beside him, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the impossible. But more important than timing is trust. You have to trust each other, trust your instincts, and trust that ordinary people will do extraordinary things when given the chance. In the year since they had arrived in London, they had helped plan 17 similar operations across occupied Europe. Not all of them had been as successful as the ProRescue, but each one had saved lives, had struck a blow against the machinery of hate, had proved that love really could change the course of history. The operation in Lyon saved 800 people, reported Colonel Harrison, the British officer who had become their primary contact. The one in Amsterdam saved over 1,000. And the network you helped establish in Poland has been responsible for saving countless more. David felt a familiar mixture of pride and humility. Each rescue was a victory, but each victory reminded him of all the people they hadn't been able to save, all the operations they hadn't been able to plan in time. What about the new intelligence from Berlin? Elena asked. Are we looking at something larger? Colonel Harrison's expression grew grave. We believe so. There are reports of a massive transport operation planned for the spring. Tens of thousands of people, all being moved to the eastern camps. David felt his blood run cold. The eastern camps were death factories, places where people were murdered with industrial efficiency. A transport of tens of thousands would represent a catastrophe beyond imagination. We need more information, David said. Routes, timing, guard strength, everything. We're working on it, Harrison replied. But there's something else. We've received word that your operation in Prague has inspired similar resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. People are organizing, planning their own rescues, using your methods as a template. Elena's eyes widened. How many people? We estimate that resistance groups inspired by your work have saved over 20,000 lives in the past year, Harrison said. The ripple effect you created is spreading faster than we ever imagined. David felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked him over. 20,000 lives. 20,000 people who were alive because of the choice they had made in that forest, because of Friedrich's sacrifice, because of the love that had given them the courage to attempt the impossible. There's something else, Harrison continued. We've been approached by a group of German officers who want to defect. They claim to be inspired by the story of Captain Weber. They want to help plan operations from the inside. David and Elena exchanged glances. The idea of working with more German officers was both thrilling and terrifying. Friedrich had been unique, a man who had found redemption in love and sacrifice. But what if these others were different? What if they were spies, or worse, what if they were sincere but not strong enough to see their commitment through? We want to meet them, Elena said finally. If they're genuinely committed to saving lives, we need to give them the chance. And if they're not? Harrison asked. Then we'll deal with that when it happens, David replied. But we can't let fear stop us from trying to save people. Fear is what the enemy wants us to feel. The meeting was arranged for the following week, in a safe house in the English countryside. David and Elena traveled there together, both of them nervous about what they might find. The German officers who wanted to defect could be their greatest allies or their greatest threat. The safe house was a charming cottage surrounded by gardens that seemed to exist in a different world from the one at war. Inside,